My goal is to always empower people that come to me. Because we are so often stripped of agency and stripped of our power, it is important when you deal with anyone, whether it's a lawyer, therapist, or whatever, that that person has good boundaries, because you're so used to turning over your agency that you could easily turn over your agency and just want a lawyer who tells you what to do. But someone who's experienced in abuse and trauma will give you information and maybe even some advice and tell you about the risks and the alternatives. But then they will empower you to make decisions and to advise them on what you want to do.
Hey friends, welcome back to the Broken to Beloved podcast. If you're looking for compassionate conversations that provide practical resources to move toward healing and wholeness, then this is the place for you. Believe it or not, Season 2 ends next week. We've now released over 50 episodes and we'll be wrapping up with an office hours. I'd love to hear from you. If you have a question or comment you'd like to share or have answered, send an email to podcast@brokentobeloved.org. Then we'll be back in July with Season 3. Today we're talking with Melissa J. Hogan. Melissa's an attorney and advocate in the field of trauma and abuse and co-author of the 2021 book, Afraid of the Doctor, Every Parent's Guide to Preventing and Managing Medical Trauma. She received her JD with an emphasis in health law from the University of Pittsburgh and went on to clerk for the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, practiced as a corporate healthcare attorney, and teaches legal writing and healthcare regulatory law. In 2014, she founded and for many years led the nonprofit Project Alive, a research and advocacy foundation for Hunter syndrome, a rare genetic disease that affects her youngest son. In that season, she developed and patented patient outcome measures, consulted on clinical trial designs, was a featured speaker at industry and FDA conferences, and won numerous awards for her advocacy. She's appeared on The Doctors, Inside the NBA, and numerous other broadcasts and podcasts, speaking in the areas of advocacy, trauma, institutional abuse, legal cases, and clinical research. This conversation covers all the things from medical diagnoses to spiritual abuse to what can we do legally about it. And I think it's going to be really interesting and I hope you enjoy it. So here is my conversation with our new friend, Melissa. Melissa, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
I'm so glad we get to do this. I was introduced to you by our mutual friend, Amy. For our listeners who may not be familiar with you, would you be willing to share a little bit of your story for us?
Sure. So I'm Melissa Hogan, and I'm an attorney, which is partly what's relevant here. And I've been lots of different attorneys. I was a corporate and securities attorney, and I also worked on the U.S. federal court system for a judge. And then I was a consultant for a while. Then I formed a nonprofit and ran that for a number of years. And then now, for the last handful of years, I've been working in the field of abuse and trauma. And that is partly based on some of my own personal experiences in that area, and then getting connected with others that see this as really a ministry in the sense of serving the church in calling out abuse and holding people accountable, but then also serving survivors and victims who, it is something that can rock your faith, especially if you've experienced abuse in the church or from supposedly Christian organizations, which is part of my story. But, part of our call is to be a witness to things that have happened, to expose misbehavior, especially misbehavior done in the Lord's name, and to hold people accountable. So just based from my own experiences and what I've learned, many years of therapy, and, just really growing in my faith myself, I see this as really purposeful work.
Yeah, thank you. Is that something hard to do, is to switch which track in law that you're pursuing or practicing?
Not really. In some cases, I have a lot of my work has been based on my personal experiences and where I felt like God was leading me to serve. When I founded, the nonprofit I founded was in my youngest son's rare disease. So he has a rare genetic disorder called Hunter syndrome. And today, the day we're recording, is actually MPS Awareness Day.
Hey.
So it's an important day in our community. His disease, Hunter syndrome, is actually mucopolysaccharidosis, or MPS 2. And it's extremely rare, about 2,000 in the world. So we
Hmm.
have a day every year that we bring awareness to it. It's a multi-system progressive degenerative disorder. And so when he was diagnosed at 2, the prognosis was he's probably going to live into his teens and progressively lose function. So I founded a nonprofit several years in to with some friends and started to raise money and raise awareness, and we funded a lot of research, and it still is going. I don't run it anymore, but it's serving families and raising a lot of awareness and generating a lot of research. So then after that, had my own experience with abuse and trauma and actually wanted to stay away from it. But a good friend connected me with an organization and some other people and really suggested, I think this would be really helpful. I think you have insight. I think it would be healing. And similar to starting the nonprofit, God just kept poking at me, and I ended up doing something I initially would not have sought out myself, but has been really healing for me and a huge blessing.
Hmm. I love that. I've had family members with really hard to diagnose issues for such a rare disease. You said 2,000 people in the world. How in the
Mhm.
world did you get a diagnosis? Was that a hard process?
Actually, I have so many miracle stories that it's
Huh.
almost unbelievable at times when I start listing off. It literally was a miracle. My
Okay.
mom is an RN, and I don't know if you remember back when cable was not digital, it was analog, and you could sometimes see cable channels through the fuzzy
Hmm.
TV. I'm dating myself here, of course. And so she would see this channel and this TV show through the fuzzy TV, and she was like, "Oh, this looks really interesting. This is a medical kind of show." And so she got cable literally to watch this TV. She found out what channel it was, Discovery Health, and it was a TV show called Mystery Diagnosis.
Huh.
So she started watching this show, and she sat down one Saturday to watch it. And it usually followed maybe 3 or 4 stories, and it would kind of interweave them in the episode. And you would follow their diagnosis journey. At the end, you would find out what they had. And one of the stories was a young boy who had a number of seemingly disparate, unrelated symptoms. He would have lots of ear infections, and he would fall and stumble, and his development wasn't progressing similarly to a kid his age. And my mom started to think, oh gosh, this seems really familiar. But I had 3 children in 3 years. So at the time, my son he was 1.5, and I had a 1.5 and a 2-year old and a 3-year old.
Wow.
And they weren't big enough symptoms that you were like, something is really wrong here. It was just a little bit off in a
Hmm.
bunch of different areas. But she got to the end of the show, and they revealed that this boy had a terrible terminal disease called Hunter syndrome. And my mom is crying because she realizes that this is probably what my son has.
Wow.
And so she waited a little while because she didn't want to scare me. And we were on a vacation together, and there were a number of symptoms that were happening. She said, this was in 2009. So you didn't have an iPhone in your pocket. You weren't Googling. And she told me about it. And I wrote it down on a sheet of paper, and she described it in a way that made it sound less serious. She called it, enzyme deficiencies, which is technically what it is, but it's an enzyme that if you don't have it, it, affects almost every area of your body. So I wrote it down. I went away for the weekend, and then I Googled it on that Monday morning. And as soon as I did and started down the rabbit hole, I knew this is what he had. So, I
Hmm.
mean, if she had not, she didn't even have cable. And the process through which God brought her to this diagnosis is nothing short of miraculous. You can't define it any other way.
Wow. So then you were able to get him in, I assume, to an appointment where they were able to confirm.
Yes, we got to genetics is where we
Okay.
had to is a genetic disorder. And we're in there with the doctor, and he's like, well, I'm going to do these tests. And they did x-rays that day. And there's certain signs on the spine that indicate one of the series of disorders, one of the MPSs. So we knew within a couple days he had one of them. And he said, well, we have to send the genetic blood test off. And I said, well, I'm telling you, I know it's Hunter syndrome. I know it is. And he's like, well, wait, and so I still have these really long emails back and forth with the geneticist asking lots of questions. And, at the time there was an FDA approved treatment to help the body that he still gets. It's an infusion every week that I do. It's about 4 hours long, but there was nothing for the brain, and the brain would slowly deteriorate. But now there's, a number of different research pathways, and he's 18 this year. He's graduating as a senior. He functions at about a 2 to 3 year old level. He's happy and a super gift to everybody.
That's amazing. I was trying to do the math in my head. I was like, okay, if he was 2 in 2009, that means he's about 18 years old. So that's amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I love hearing it.
He is a blessing in my life. God changed me at, one of the things, and this is what I've learned, like the things that you think are the worst things. And I've had other terrible things. And one thing I've learned is I no longer feel like I have to make something good out of something terrible. But I have seen that God can use it in a way that changes you and changes the people around you. And see, gonna get me all teary eyed. A couple years ago, my middle son passed away. I think and other people.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Know. And that was one of those things where you're like, I had a lot of arguments with God, and I
believe
said,
it.
I have a son that's dying. How fair is it for another child of mine to die? And when I realized that basically what I was doing was having an argument with God about that, I was very much reminded, because I struggled with infertility. I had 4 miscarriages before I had kids, and I could have not had kids at all. But here God gave me these 3 children for whatever period of time that it is. And I had to recognize that as a gift, even if my middle son lived to 17. And even if my youngest son is 18, and who knows, we don't know how long we have, but it's those hard lessons.
Yeah. And I think what I appreciate is beyond the obvious tenderness that you have for your children, that there is such a strong sense of faith that isn't coupled with some sort of spiritual bypassing. Like you're saying, like, I don't have to make something good out of it, and yet here's where we are. And I appreciate, telling us how you've had that wrestling period with God. Just like, why? Like, it's the honesty is there. The felt emotion of that loss is there. I think even just the loss of imagined futures for our children or for our families, like getting a diagnosis. Like, we have so many people in our community who I hear from who have had or currently struggle with things like infertility or autoimmune diseases or undiagnosable things and chronic illness and all this kind of stuff. So I hear from people fairly often, and it's so often either overlooked or dismissed, or worse. Like, there's so much rhetoric today around illnesses and worth and dignity of people who are not completely able-bodied. And what does that mean for things like research, things like medication, things like treatments, things like all these things, or what it means for you as a citizen or not a citizen, or all of this kind of stuff. So I really appreciate you taking the time to share all that with us.
Yeah, no, thank you. I can't take the credit. I would be a different person if it had been for my youngest son being diagnosed, and even still with the loss of my middle son.
Yeah.
And God just keeps forming us in ways that sometimes we don't want.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. Let's switch tracks a little bit. You write a newsletter, Res Ipsa.
Yes.
You say where you explore the intersection of the law, faith, and abuse. What in the world does Res Ipsa mean?
Res ipsa. So there's a phrase in law called res ipsa loquitur, and it means the thing speaks for itself. So when something happens that is often terrible, the example they use is like an elevator drops in the shaft and people die. If someone sues for that, the fact that the elevator dropped, we all know it shouldn't drop, that speaks for itself. There's not really a lot of other proof you have to have that something went wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really struck by that phrase because, especially in abuse, the average age for someone who is a victim of child sexual abuse to disclose and speak about their abuse is past the age of 50.
Yeah.
And so often, victims, don't either don't report or they're silenced, or often you don't even realize that what happened to you is abuse
Mm-hmm.
because of either different cultural dynamics, faith dynamics, patterns of manipulation of the abuser themselves. And so often the speaking is absent, and it's just the thing. It is the abuse, it is the manipulation, it is the terrible thing, and it's just there. And so, that is the res ipsa, the thing.
Mm-hmm.
And what I thought in writing this, I am going to loquitur. That is what we're doing. We're going to talk about it. We are going to speak about it and hopefully educate people and have a conversation about how this stuff happens and how it can go on for so long and in such patterns that we don't see it, or that, it happens over and over in some kind of faith setting.
And I think you have a couple of other phrases. Is that right?
Well, I do say a lot. Sunshine is the best of disinfectants.
I say that too.
Yeah, that is a quote from a late Supreme Court Justice Brandeis. And it is talking about the fact that in the dark is where things fester. That's where infections happen. There's an analogy that I talk about that often when people have some type of infection. So my son, when he was about 3, 4 years old, he had MRSA. And it wasn't an open wound. It started as a red spot that kind of grew and looked really inflamed. And you could see that on the surface. And then he stopped walking. And I actually sent a picture to a friend of mine who's an ER doc. And she's like, that looks bad. It looks, like some kind of infection. You need to take him to the ER.
Hmm.
And what happens is there's an infection under the skin and you don't know what it is, but it's bad and it's painful, but you cannot heal it until what they do is they lance it. They open it up with a scalpel, and they have to dig out the infection sometimes, or they have to use something called a wound vac and suck out the infection. And in the field of abuse, it can look like it's not that bad, either personally or in a ministry setting. But when you dig in there and you realize the unhealthy dynamics and you talk to people about the pain and the damage that has happened to them, that is part of that lancing open. And sunlight, exposure to the air, exposure to light and healing and antibiotics, that is what actually brings healing. But so often we just want to look at it and go, well, the skin's not broken. It's fine. But that can kill you. It can kill a church. It can kill people's faith, and often does.
Yeah. Well, I think that's so important because in cases of abuse, it is often that, like you're saying, it's like let the thing speak for itself, bring it out into the light and stop hiding it in the shadows so that we can actually do something about it and let it heal or let it be healed. And you talk about this idea that with things like, quote unquote, regular abuse, that there are these visible wounds, right?
Mm-hmm.
Cuts, bruises, violence, some kind of evidence that people see. But with spiritual abuse, it's so hard because they don't leave visible signs. And then I think you write, when survivors bring their cases to court, these mental scars are often misunderstood, misrepresented, or totally ignored. So what do we do about that? Or what can we do about that?
It is so spiritual abuse is similar to or a form of emotional abuse.
Mm-hmm.
And so in both of those cases, there's not a physical scar. And the damage so much is internal to the victims, to the survivors, and to the organization or family or entity that it's happening in. So one of the things that we have to do is educate and inform, because people can't understand that abuse is happening to them or in their ministry or in their family unless they understand what that is. And for so long, we have said abuse is physical violence.
Mm-hmm.
And thankfully, over the years, there has been a lot of education, but there still needs to be more. There's more books. Part of my story is I was in an emotionally abusive marriage for over 20 years. I had no idea that what was happening to me was abuse because I wasn't being hit.
Mm.
But I will tell you, I was suicidal by the end of my marriage and at multiple points. I was so confused all the time. I was so devalued. I was a shell of a person. And I've heard very similar stories to many other people that were in emotionally abusive relationships, but then also in spiritually abusive settings. It's like somebody takes a dull spoon and just starts carving your soul and your identity out of you a tiny bit at a time until you are
Mm-hmm.
left with very little. And in faith settings, it's even worse in the sense of it's intertwined with your faith. And so that is so confusing. You're like, wait a second, you, pastor, are supposed to be the representation of Jesus to me, but you're doing these things. And so is that who God is like? Is that what Jesus is? And you're supposed to respect and in many cases you're supposed to obey your pastor and your elders. But when you intertwine all of that, it's so confusing.
Yeah.
And so one of the signs that I've read and I look at for when abuse is often present is when there is confusion. When, in the Bible even talks about the confusion is of the devil. When there's confusion over long periods of time and a lack of resolution of things, despite the victim or the survivor's often very well documented and repeated over long periods of time effort to bring about some kind of change or resolution, that's often when abuse is present.
When you say documentation, if someone is under suspicion that they are experiencing abuse or they're just sure of it,
Yeah,
how do you start to document stuff?
that's a really good question. And I often get that question from survivors. I look at two kinds of evidence. There's primary evidence and then there's secondary evidence. And when I
Okay.
talk about this as evidence, this is both the lawyer brain of if you were trying to prove something in court.
Mm-hmm.
But trying to prove something in court, the reason that exists is because those are often the most reliable ways to prove to other people and to later prove to yourself what
Yeah.
actually happened, to unwind
Yep.
and say, no, this is what happened. So like primary evidence is direct evidence of the events. So not your interpretation, but direct evidence of this is what this person said, this is what this person did. And the best evidence, of course, is recordings. So video recordings, audio recordings, and you have to be careful in the sense that there are laws related to video and audio recordings. And you'll in this field, you'll hear people talk about a one-party state or a two-party state. And a one-party state is a state where only one person that is part of a conversation has to consent to it being recorded. And that one person is you. So you can essentially, quote, secretly record conversations that you're having with an abuser or a suspected abuser and go back later and listen to them. And that is what I did, and often what people do that are in abusive situations, because, like I said, the confusion and gaslighting is another term you'll hear a lot. And gaslighting
Yeah.
is where your reality is so twisted in ways it's not just deception. It's like you say, well, but yesterday you said and did these things. And they go, no, I didn't. I didn't say or do any of those things. And then you're like, wait, am I
Yeah.
misremembering? Is that,
You
and
must
when
have
that
heard that
happens,
wrong. There's no way
yeah,
I would have said, yeah.
happens long enough, you slowly don't trust yourself
Hmm.
anymore. You lean into trusting the abuser about who you are, what actually happened, who said what your identity is, what the organization or family is. So by recording, you can go back and realize, okay, this is what was actually said. And you can actually do it in a way that is slower, and it's not while it's happening while you're currently being traumatized by that person and confused. So that's the best primary evidence. Also, primary is like writings. So if someone who's suspected of abuse wrote certain things, they wrote you a letter, they wrote journals, they, wrote things to the church, wrote emails. So emails and things in, exchanges that you have with that person, like I said, recordings, if that's possible, that's the best primary evidence. And then, you get a little bit away from that, and that is like your own testimony. So you can tell what happened, but then people can say, well, you're not credible, or
Right.
other people. But also secondary evidence is, you had that conversation and then right afterwards you went and wrote notes about it. So those are called like contemporaneous notes is when you're taking them at the time, but notes taken soon after, or soon after an event, you describe it to someone else. And so that person is basically a corroborating witness that I had this conversation. Then I called, Sally over here and said, this conversation I just had with my husband or my pastor was this.
Hmm.
So, you can start to get other pieces of evidence. And that's part of what I did myself in about the last 6 months of my marriage. As I started recording things, I started collecting uh, notes and journals, things that my abuser had written down himself. And later on, I was able to go back, or I was also able to show those things and play them for my therapist, who could interpret them and go, do you hear what's happening here in this
Mm.
conversation? This is how this manipulation is happening. And when you are walking with someone who's trauma informed, they can help you see that. And I could go back to the papers later. I called them the crazy papers because I would keep them in my desk and pull them out and go, okay, I don't like that word crazy. But that's what I called them at the time. I could look at these papers and go, I'm not crazy. This is this is what was said and written down, and this is really disturbing stuff. So,
Hmm.
people starting to collect those types of information can help them either in a legal case. It can help you explain to other people what happened, and it can help recenter your own identity and sanity.
Yeah. Yeah, because so often you start really losing and questioning your sanity,
Yeah.
especially the longer you're in that environment or in that relationship. I'm guessing people can just go online and search for whether they live in a one or two party state.
Yes, you should be able to Google that. If you want to develop some kind of real plan for documenting things, it would be good to talk to a lawyer because
Hmm.
there are some intricacies involved in recording, and especially if you think you may bring some kind of a legal case or be subject to a legal case. So one of the things we're seeing lately after the Johnny Depp case was a number of alleged abusers bringing defamation cases against people who speak out about them. Either they're victims, survivors, or organizations that expose or have consequences for them relative to the allegations of abuse. So, also, victims and organizations need to protect themselves against the possibility that an alleged abuser may sue them for defamation.
Which is just wild.
It is a wild series of events to watch that play out. And the hard part, people say, well, another piece of advice that people often come to me for is, can I tell my story? Or how can I most
Hmm.
safely tell my story about what happened to me in this situation of abuse while creating the least risk that I might get sued for defamation by my abuser? So
Yeah.
walking through strategies for that. But the hard part is, people say, well, can they sue me? Sadly, people can sue almost anybody for anything. And, you can then be subject to legal fees that, even if you are correct, now you can try to go back and get them later, but it's a difficult and challenging thing. So it is smart on the front end to think about at least the most likely safest way to tell your story and avoid or minimize the risk of
Hmm.
sued by an abuser.
Yeah. So if people wanted to search that, what term are they looking for? One or two party
One or two party states for
states. Okay.
recording. Mhm.
Okay. And then I appreciate that you say that you have, if it's a corroborating witness or if it's contemporaneous evidence of something you wrote down soon after it happened, that you can bring it to a third party like a therapist or a friend for them to interpret for you. I feel like that's so important because when we're in the middle of it, it's so hard to make sense of what's actually happening. Just yesterday, I was sharing a story in a group, and the person facilitating the group was like, "Do you hear how much hope you have?" And I was like, "What are you even talking about? Like, this story has no hope." And he goes, "No, no, no. I want you to." And then he pointed out a few other things later in the conversation that I never would have thought of. And it's just like, where did you even get that? He goes, "How are you not there yet?" I said, because this is my mental block. This is the black hole of memory of this period of my life. And I feel like that's so important to have that compassionate witness who's there for you to protect you, to help you, to interpret the evidence and to interpret what you've written down the way you remember it,
Mhm.
whether it's a false memory or not. It was your experience, just to say, hey, here's what I'm seeing here. And I feel like that helps so much, just to have that compassionate witness.
Yeah. And I mean, it doesn't have to be a therapist, because I
Mm-hmm.
recognize too, therapy, especially if it's not covered by insurance, is very expensive.
Yes.
I know, I had a privilege of being able to afford therapy, but not everybody does. And so, there are different options that people can look into, whether it's, paid therapy or insurance covered therapy. Online therapy can sometimes be cheaper. There's often free support groups. So especially in cases of, domestic abuse, and we're not just talking physical domestic abuse, any kind of domestic abuse, including emotional abuse, verbal abuse. Domestic violence shelters often have support groups that are free that you can go to. And I myself have been in one for years, because you're trying in a group setting. There often can be a lot of help because you see these patterns and you go, oh, wait, uh, these abusive people are pretty similar, and you see the patterns in other people. It's very validating. So support groups like that, organizations can often connect you with either online supports or even Facebook groups. I know there's Facebook groups for survivors of emotional abuse and spiritual abuse, or even other one or two other people that have experienced it. They can't be your therapist, but they can be a sounding board to go, wait a second,
Mm-hmm.
this happened. Have you ever experienced this? And how did you think about it? Especially people that are a little further down the pathway.
Yeah.
Now, having enough capacity to do that is, a challenge as well when you're also still healing. But I think as you heal, you learn boundaries and you learn to speak about what capacity you have and respect one another's boundaries. So that gets a little bit easier.
Yeah. Yeah. You work with Grace, Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment, as a lawyer, correct?
Uh, I'm an independent contractor and I'm a lead investigator.
Lead
So I'm
investigator. I
not,
was going to say, I thought
yeah.
it was investigator, but I know your background is law. So what does that mean? What does that work look like?
So organizations engage Grace to investigate, or there's assessments as well. There's an assessment group as well, when there have been some kind of allegations of either abuse, misconduct, and it could be sexual, spiritual, behavioral, different kinds of allegations. And they bring in Grace as an independent investigator. So while there is a contract, and again, I'm speaking for myself, not on behalf of Grace here or in this interview, Grace acts as an independent investigator. So not required to, make findings in one area or another in terms of what has happened independently, evaluating, looking, reviewing documentation, interviewing witnesses, site visits to locations, and evaluates what likely happened here. We apply a lot of the principles you use in law, credibility, corroboration, different things. And usually the teams for investigations are generally two investigators, and one of them is often a lawyer. And so, we have lots of training in terms of, the systems that we use and the processes, and just informational training to make sure we stay up to speed on all of these issues internally. So yeah, it's been such a journey, and it is really meaningful to bring clarity. I'm a writer at heart, so I often explain that it's really important to me in writing reports, and they're done as a team, and there's a peer review process. So it's not just one person out there, writing the things and making decisions about what likely has happened in a case. It's a very team approach. But one thing when I participate in writing a report is bringing clarity to an issue and educating and helping or doing my best to try to help, whether it's the survivors themselves, the organization, or if a report is public, anyone who reads it, to understand how this happened, how this environment existed, the impact on the people, what could have been done by the organization in receiving these allegations, what actually was done, what can be done in the future to both attempt to make amends, attempt to prevent this from happening in the future. So storytelling in that form is really important to me because, abuse does not happen in isolation. And
Yeah.
this is the mistake I think a lot of organizations make. They're like, oh, we found that guy and he's gone and we're good. We're all good now. And even if it just happens one time, there is something in the system
Yep.
for how that person came in, how they stayed, how it remained undetected, how they harmed. But often what you find out is you think it's one person,
Yeah.
and often it's more than one person, or there's enablers. And so if you just take out that one person, there is a system that
Yep.
exists in an organization that needs to be healed. It needs to be wound vac. It needs to be examined transparently and objectively, and then healed. And it's the same in domestic abuse. Yes, there usually is a primary abuser, but the impact on everyone else in the family system, everybody else shifts and changes. So even when that abuser is gone, the damage that is there has to be discovered and recognized and faced transparently and objectively and worked to be healed.
Yeah. Yeah. I found a quote. I was thinking about it when we were talking earlier from Shannon Martin, who says that turning on the lights poses no danger. It simply shows us what was already in the room.
Oh, that's so good.
Isn't it?
Shannon too.
I know, me
Yeah.
too. I love her stuff. That's so helpful. And it is exactly that. It's never just one person. There was something about the system that allowed that person to get away with it.
Yeah. And I had, for me, part of the healing for me and then for my children was in therapy and going, what drew me to that person? What made me not see the red flags when I was 18 years old?
Mm-hmm.
And it's often things in our childhood. It's things that are normalized So when something is normalized, this certain type of behavior, certain type of deception, practices of sweeping things under the rug and not dealing with them, or people pleasing, when you learn those as a child in your family of origin, and then those are like wonderful to an abuser. They're like, oh, fabulous. This person's not going to see what I do. They're going to
Yep.
keep trying to please me. They're going to keep trying and trying. The two studies have talked about the two qualities of, specifically, I think this is in domestic abuse, but I see it in other areas as well, that exist in victims are conscientiousness and agreeableness. So
Mm.
you keep trying to work, you keep trying to solve it and help and do your part. And before you know it, you've taken on all this and you're agreeable. You're like, okay, I guess maybe he is right. Those parts, that the other parts of the system have to examine themselves, even though they didn't cause it, it's not their fault. And, but there are things that have to be healed. And for me, like before I was ever going to enter any other relationship, which I actually never intended to for the longest time, I had to figure all that out and heal so you wouldn't be in that same kind of situation again. And that's why you often see people that are multiple victims because they have learned patterns of behavior that have made them susceptible and attractive to abusers as someone who's a great person to take in and manipulate.
Yeah, that's it. Do you think that there is a threshold for when someone who is a survivor or who is currently experiencing abuse to contact or reach out to a lawyer?
That's a good question. If you feel like you might need to reach out to a lawyer, that often means you need to reach out to a lawyer. Like
Hmm.
that suspicion of like, ooh, I much more now trust my intuition, which was given to us by God. And often I believe are promptings of the Holy Spirit. So if there is a reason, there's something happening, if you feel like you may need to reach out to a lawyer. And a lot of lawyers have either, free or reduced cost consultations that maybe they can give you, 30 minutes of their time for a much lower rate. And it may be a very wise investment. But there's also things you can read if you go online. You can read Res Ipsa and learn a lot. You can, read things from other lawyers who are either in areas of abuse or non-disclosure agreements. That's another area that I talk
Yeah.
about, people ask about, or cease and desist letters. So you can learn a lot, thankfully, on the internet now.
Hmm.
But taking that next step might be helpful if you feel like you need to
Yeah.
talk to a lawyer.
Yeah. Well, and what sort of outcomes if someone were to look for a lawyer? Because I think a lot of times we get crippled by the idea of like, I don't even know what I'm supposed to do right now, or I don't even know what I can do or what my options are, because we're so often stripped of agency and
Mhm.
stripped of options when we're experiencing abuse. So even if I were to pursue something legally, which most people feel like, but I don't want to do that. I don't want to get this person in trouble. I don't want to, this person was my, XYZ, whatever it is. I had a conversation with David Pooler recently down at Baylor who's saying that
I do.
it's awful because sometimes that's the only option that we have is because someone broke the law that it's the only accountability measure we have in place because churches so often refuse to hold pastors and leaders accountable in any kind of meaningful way, to strip them of their credentials or remove them a position or whatever it is. So if someone were to get involved legally in something like this, what are potential outcomes? Like what do we look for or hope for at the end of a whole legal thing?
There's a lot of different paths that you can go down in that. And to your original point,
Mm-hmm.
you're correct. Not there are a lot of churches or organizations that will never seek an independent investigation because they
Yeah.
don't actually, they're missing that humility, and I would call it like trust in the Lord and releasing the outcomes
Yeah.
and just wanting to look for the truth and how to minister to people. So a lot of organizations will never hire an independent investigator. And their language, sadly, is power and money
Yeah.
and influence. And, they will only feel the effects of the harm that they've done and potentially change if it is exposed, if it hurts them a little bit by paying money. And, so many victims don't care about money
Right.
and don't, even when it's costing them. Look, I was in 6 years of therapy, cost me probably a car. Even when victims are having to pay for therapy, they're losing money at their job because they're not
Hmm.
as functional as they otherwise would be. They're losing time with their kids and their loved ones because of panic attacks and experiencing symptoms. You do not hear victims screaming, "Oh, I just want to gouge them for a bunch of money." That is hardly anyone's motivation.
Yeah.
But it can be helpful to deal with the impact of abuse. And it can also make an impact on that organization to possibly help prevent this from happening again, possibly help them institute things, especially if they have an insurance company. Then that insurance company gets involved and they're like, "Oh, wow, this is a problem. How about you do these things so we don't have to pay another claim?" So, back to your question. Okay, you're going to have to lead me back.
What outcomes can people hope for if they were to work with a lawyer?
Right. Well, so I am a strategic person in terms of what are the possibilities, but also my goal is to always empower people that come to me.
Hmm.
And, you know, because we are so often stripped of agency and stripped of our power, it is important when you deal with anyone, whether it's a lawyer, therapist, or whatever, that that person has good boundaries, because you're so used to turning over your agency that you could easily turn over your agency and just want a lawyer who tells you what to do. But someone who's experienced in abuse and trauma will give you information and maybe even some advice and tell you about the risks and the alternatives. But then they will empower you to make decisions and to advise them on what you want to do. So, that's the first step, is to really understand what the options are from the lawyer. And those options can be things like, how do I want to warn other people? How
Hmm.
do I speak out? So it may not involve filing any kind of lawsuit. So there could be, strategies for, publicly speaking out. How do I protect myself? There can be strategies for either filing some kind of lawsuit that could involve money, but it could also involve requests that they make certain changes. So a court can't necessarily force an organization to make certain changes, but once you make a demand of an organization generally through a lawyer, you would send something called a demand letter, and you say, "Here's a general summary of what has happened and a likely case that we would bring. And here's what we're asking you to do." And that can be settling for a certain amount of money, but it can also say, "We want you to do these things so this doesn't happen to anybody else." Or kind of like, hold an independent investigation, announce these things, and look for additional victims. Now, the victim can do that as well. Sometimes victims start publicly speaking to try to find if there are other victims of that
Yeah.
abuse out there. So, yes, lawsuits, and that can take on lots of different forms. There can be other challenges. Like I said, if someone has signed an NDA or has been proposed an NDA, or let's say they worked for a church or an organization and they were let go, and so they got severance and some kind of agreement. So, understanding what that is a good next step, because, legal documents, you can feel like you understand some of the obligations, but there's intricacies in there about how you could or couldn't speak out and what you could do at that point.
Hmm.
I will say one specific theoretically Christian organization that I've had dealings with now, my understanding is they require employees to sign a document when they come into the organization as an employee, that you lose all your rights to sue. It's mandatory arbitration, and there's also non-disclosure and non-disparagement. So you are giving up
That is wild.
so many rights in going to work with this theoretically Christian financial organization that
Right.
got me gag order for 7 months, that I would never recommend anyone
Yeah.
give up those rights in any kind of organization, whether it's a church, a ministry, a secular organization, ever.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Thank you. I think it's going to help clear it up because I think so often people hear lawyer and they just immediately imagine, or at least I do, a court case. It's like, I don't want to go that far. So just even hearing in terms of having counsel or advice or just, hey, would you read this through me or
Mhm.
help me figure out what options I have? Can people reach out to you? Like, where do they go look for a lawyer? Like, do I have to look for someone who's practicing in my state? Is it something like when they reach out to Grace and they just get connected to someone else who's an investigator or lawyer? If I'm just wondering, it's like my story is crazy, but I don't know what I should do or have capacity to do.
Yeah, there's a couple different angles. Grace does not refer people to lawyers. So again,
Okay.
they do safeguarding work where they come in and train churches and organizations, and then they also do independent investigations and assessments. So they do often get calls from victims who maybe want their organization to conduct an independent investigation. And so they do give free consultations related to that type of work, or, victims often really work hard to pressure in good ways their organization to conduct an independent investigation. But if someone's looking for advice about their personal legal situation, or strategies about what to do in those cases, yeah, they should look for contacting a lawyer directly. I mean, I can be reached. My law practice is called kava law. And if people are familiar with the word kava, it's from the Bible, and it's often translated in the Bible as wait, but it's so much more full than that. I've seen it discussed as holy anticipation, or
Hmm.
waiting with eager anticipation for what, often in the context of what God is going to do. So that word has been a huge word for me. And so that's the name of my practice. It's QAV as in Victor AH. So I'm at kavalaw.com. I'm also, like, people can reach out to me on Substack, on all my socials. I'm Melissa J. Hogan. But there are also other lawyers that have been involved in other cases. One of my dear friends and colleagues is Boz Chivijian, who is obviously a landmark lawyer in this field, and he's at Boz Law. But there are other lawyers as well, and nobody's competing for this work.
Hmm.
We got into it out of our own personal love for God and love for people and experience. And if someone can't help you or doesn't have experience, they'll try to refer you to someone that can.
Yeah. Thank you. As we close, let's go back to the beginning and let you talk about your book.
Great, thanks. Yes. So in 2021, in the middle of COVID, I released a co-authored book called Afraid of the Doctor: Every Parent's Guide to Preventing and Managing Medical Trauma. And that came from my son's experience. He has had so many interactions with the medical system that he started being very uncooperative, kicking, screaming. It's medical anxiety that often children or even adults experience, but it's at a much more extreme level. And so I did a ton of research in trying to help him, and I started blogging about it and eventually wrote an ebook early on. But it kept being a huge issue, especially in the special needs community, that eventually I reached out to one of the experts in the field, Dr. Megan Marsack, and cold pitched her that we write this book together. She couldn't believe that there was not a book out there already, and we became fast friends. She's just a dear, caring person who loves children, and she works in a children's hospital in Kentucky and is the head of essentially the medical trauma kind of department there. And so we wrote this book to really help families, and it's not just for parents of children with special needs. I used all these strategies on my typical children as well. It gives very specific strategies and seeks to be empowering. I had an interview with someone recently who read it, who it was helpful for them with the adults in their life as a caregiver as well. So not just children. But this was really a labor of love to take something that I learned through caring for my son and try to help other people. So, like I said, I don't know. I no longer feel like I have to do that
Hmm.
with things that have been hard and painful. But in that circumstance, I felt like it was a hole in what was out there, and that it would be helpful for parents. And so I'm really proud of that, and have gotten just wonderful conversations with people about how it has helped their kids.
Yeah. And the nonprofit is Project Alive, correct?
Yes, Project Alive, and it's still doing amazing work. And I'm so proud of the team there, and the families that keep this good fight in all the MPS disorders. Since, like I said, today is MPS Awareness Day.
Yeah, I love it. Melissa, thank you so much. We'll provide all of those links for everyone in the show notes. So appreciate you taking the time to walk us through kind of possibilities and options in terms of legal stuff, because I think it's such a scary world for people who aren't part of it. It's like, I don't know if I can. I don't know if I can afford to. I don't know what would happen. I don't want to drag all these people in. And I'm really hoping this conversation will help bring some clarity and maybe even some courage for some of our listeners. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
I found that so helpful. As someone who knows very little about law or the legal world, I find it kind of intimidating and a little bit scary. So I hope this conversation provides some clarity and maybe even some courage to figure out your next right thing. You can find all the links we referenced in the show notes. Next time, we'll be closing out season 2 with office hours. I'll be answering a few of your questions and sharing some updates. Again, you can always reach us by emailing podcast@brokentobeloved.org. Subscribe or follow the show to get new episodes automatically. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating and review or share it with your friends. As a 501c3 nonprofit, our work is made possible by our generous donors. If this has been helpful to you, would you consider joining us today at brokentobeloved.org/support? Thanks so much for taking the time out of your day to listen. I hope it's been helpful. Here's to moving toward healing and wholeness together. I'll see you next time.